China having people internally working on medias or buying media or teachers or professors or influential people. How much of that is still happening today?
It's huge, massive scale, not just in the US, but in just about every country. So, for example, in Canada, they had the Sidewinder report from their equivalent to the CIA, which detailed how the Chinese regime had basically bought off a lot of politicians. In Australia, this is actually a discussion in the mainstream, news outlets. It's part of the cultural discussion right now. The degree to which the Chinese regime has bought control of their local politicians, the degree to which the Chinese regime is able to influence the society through things like this, not just at the political level, but even at the universities and things like that. In the US, I think the discussion is just starting. It's just now I think the lid is being opened. And I think people are going to start seeing the extent to which the Chinese regime has gained control over a lot of our politicians, has gained control over a lot of the decision making in this country, not just on the financial level, but even on some of the direct levels. When it comes to things like the Confucius Institutes, Chinese funded, language and culture programs at universities, where universities are taking money from the Chinese regime when these institutes can implement all kinds of things like censorship and such. They're being called out in a lot of countries. Sweden, for example, just banned the last Confucius Institute from their country. When it comes to things like the Torch program, the 1,000 Talents program, the 973 program, the 211 program, essentially a basket of programs the Chinese regime has, official open programs to subvert our academic institutions and our business institutions. They're open about these things. And so the Chinese regime is very aggressive with this. Not only is it aggressive with it, it doesn't even try to hide it in the US, because for so long it has acted with audacity. It is not afraid. It wasn't afraid of people looking into it and trying to figure these things out. This is an example. Last I checked, even a few weeks ago, the Chinese consulate website in New York has the United Front listed as one of its operations. It has the liaison department listed as one of its operations. The liaison department is under the general political department. This is the political warfare branch of the Chinese military. We all heard all this stuff about, Russian disinformation and Russian interference in our elections. China has an entire military department dedicated to this. The general political department, run through the liaison department, operating openly in New York City through the Chinese consulate website. There's a think tank, Project 2049 Institute had a whole report actually on the liaison department.
So how many similarities do you see for you to make a statement to say you believe they're going to go down and they're not going to stay like this? How much similarity do you see between them and Russia pre-communism and post-communism, when Russia was going strong with communism, and then all of a sudden, hey, bring the wall down, and then next thing you know, the philosophy changes. This is post-Gorbachev, and things start kind of opening up a little bit more. How much similarity do you see between Russia and China, the old Russia with the current China?
The situation is actually very similar on many fronts. And so, whereas the Chinese regime has these systems of overt warfare, under the Soviets, they called that ideological subversion. This unrestricted warfare program, the Soviets have called it ideological subversion. It's the same thing. The Chinese regime just carried the torch of it. When it comes to business ties, it's very much the same thing. You had a lot of big corporations manufacturing in Russia. You had a lot of the same, overlapping business interests, although on the political level, there was a lot of conflict. When it came to the academic subversion, the communists in the Soviet Union were pushing for the global communist revolution. And a lot of academics and a lot of people in Hollywood were, working with the Soviet regime. And of course, at that time, if you were, a Communist Party member, for example, it meant you were loyal to the Soviet regime. The system is exactly the same. The only difference is that at the time, a lot of people recognized the Soviet Union as a hostile nation to the United States because you had threats of nuclear war. It was a lot more military, the perception was a lot more military based. The Chinese regime doesn't have that perception. And so they're able to operate with a lot more impunity. They're able to operate with a lot, a cleaner face, essentially, for the world to look at. But essentially, the situation underneath the hood is all the same. It's exactly the same. And just like the collapse of the Soviet Union, I frankly believe that the collapse of the Chinese Communist Party is going to catch a lot of people by surprise.